So it's so fun to be on stage with Darren today because Darren and I have been a couple of the people out here trying to make remote work happen since before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And there's not that many of us. So one of the things is, we've both been so busy these past few years, like building and taking on new roles, as Darren has just done at Andela. And it's fun to be able to just sit next to you and ask you a bunch of questions that I know we're really spiritually aligned on, but have different perspectives on.
Yeah.
And I thought we could just start the conversation by talking about, how each of us came to this work and what we do, because do you have difficulty explaining what you do at a cocktail party?
No, it's perfectly clear to everyone.
Very good.
Yes. Great question. It's I'm grateful to be here with all of you. I'll start by saying thanks for making time for this session. Annie, thanks for the invite. It's truly a privilege to be here talking about this with you. So how did I end up here? So what I tell people is that for the most part, people follow a pretty similar path in their career, which is at some point when you're a child, someone asks you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And at some point you determine what that is. And then at some juncture, largely unconscious, you allow an HR department to tell you where you're going to do that thing. And you're just totally okay with uprooting your family and putting them somewhere else. And I just could never square with that reality. Like just that little nugget just seemed patently absurd to me, right? So I just, from the get-go, contrarian mindset, like that, the whole way the world is structured, it's just not going to work for me. And so what I did instead is I optimized for the life I wanted to live. And then I found organizations, teams, and people that were progressive enough to let me do that while contributing to their business mission. And so I flipped the whole notion on its head is I'm going to optimize for the life I want to live and then find work that would support that.
Yeah.
So for the past 16 years, pre-COVID, it was largely me being the contrarian and having to find these niche organizations or the right people that could see into the future and that would allow me to achieve the business goals that they wanted, but from wherever I wanted, instead of where their HR department would generally tell the team to be. And so in the course of doing that, I discovered a lot of things, which is distributed work done well is actually a massive competitive advantage, a massive unlock for efficiency, for productivity, for the amount of talent and the type of talent you can get. It enables you to have true diversity, not manufactured diversity. You can get true geographic diversity and pull people in. And it's been one of these things that I didn't intend to get into remote strategy and operations. I just did the work I loved in places that I loved. But when you fast forward 16 years and you look back, you're like, oh, that was the common thread. And so it started with me being too stubborn to just do it the way the world wanted. But now that experience has become massively applicable as knowledge workers around the world have the best opportunity they've ever had in my lifetime to truly prioritize where they want to be, the community they want to be in, and then integrate work into that instead of it being the other way around.
I love what you said, that the way the world is designed is just not going to work for me.
It's just not going to work.
That's so speaks to the spirit of what it means to go out there and be an entrepreneur and a disruptor.
Yeah.
And, I'm not surprised that you found yourself in such an innovative place and role. Talk to me about what you did at GitLab and what you're now doing at Andela.
Yeah, so GitLab, if you're not familiar with GitLab, we made history in 2021 by becoming the world's first fully remote company to ever IPO. It had never happened before. And when GitLab first found me, they were looking for this alien type person, this unicorn type person, someone that had lived and breathed remote work because GitLab was founded fully remote, no offices, but also understood codifying it and baking it into actual strategy and operation and narrative so that we could fortify our operations to withstand the rigors of being a public company. And it had never been done before. And I remember in the interview process, their CEO, Sid, he intentionally built GitLab as an officeless company and leveraged that as a competitive advantage. And we can go into this more, but when you do that, when you're intentional about that, the skyscraper that you build looks nothing like this, but it is just as intentional. You have to think about the tools and the upskilling, the type of people that you want. And he said, we want to scale this to a place where we can become the world's first company to do it. And some funny backstory there. A lot of people said it could not be done. Along GitLab's journey, there were quite a few funding rounds where VCs would come, they would hear the pitch, and then afterwards they would say, we love everything about this company, but like I can't just write a check into the ether. Like, what am I buying? And it's funny that now you're like, LOL. But at the time, that was a very reasonable thing because, like, what is this? What is this? And when you think about it, business is just a collection of people. Like, we don't need the four walls and a roof to make it so. And so over 3.5 years, we did that. When I joined the company, we were 700 people. When I left, we were 1,700 across 60 countries with no company-owned offices. And it was one of the tightest, most authentic, genuine cultures imaginable across the planet. We heard this morning about the McKinsey OHI. I started getting that in motion before I left, and I caught up with Phil, who drove the OHI at GitLab just last week, and he showed me some of the results, and he said it's just truly frame-breaking, the results that we found. The line that will stick with me is he said, we were looking for opportunities to share with GitLab of how to improve, like how do you get better on this org design that you've built. And he said, a partner on my team said, it's kind of like going up to Lionel Messi and trying to coach him to be better at soccer. There are probably some things he could learn from Ronaldo to be a little bit better, but at the end of the day, like this is a pretty amazing structure. And that gives me a lot of confidence that although it is still incredibly rare and niche, this model can work if you put the right investment into it.
And I want to talk a lot about that today because I think helping people understand what this model looks like is really important to think about the future.
Yeah.
But before we go there, I'll kind of give my own story
Please.
about how I got to this work. So I started my career as a corporate attorney. I represented big banks. I was a transactions attorney. I was at my desk until 4 o'clock in the morning every night, waiting for deal docs to come in from overseas. And when I had my children, which was, I had earlier in my career, it just felt really wasteful. It was very painful to not be able to see my children, at any point during the day, and trying to manage breastfeeding, in that context was just really difficult. And I started to become very interested in whether my personal experience was actually a macro experience and what impact that macro experience might be having. And once you start to scratch the surface, it was really obvious how macro the experience really was, and that women were really dropping out of the workforce, not because of the prevailing narratives at the time about failure to leave it in or ability to negotiate, but because they actually were just exhausted, which I certainly was too. And so when I had my second son, who ultimately was born and had a rare genetic condition, which has led me, down a totally different path, it really recentered me, and I realized that I needed to focus on building solutions that were interesting to me and meaningful to me in the world. And so I left SLAW and I founded a startup. And that startup was ultimately a data and analytics company for the Fortune 2000 to help them unpack and understand flexibility in remote work. My younger son, the one with the genetic condition, was born in 2015. So I founded the company in 2016. And it was really interesting. We had really big buyers like Apple and Amex, and all of these companies would come to us and seek our data and analytics. But there was such a misalignment. The CEO was all like, this is a women's problem. And there would be a business unit leader who was like, actually, this could be really strategic. And the chief people officer would always really get it. And what we did is we built an algorithm to understand objective pain points. So we weren't asking people how they felt. We weren't asking people what they wanted. But we just measured how painful is your day-to-day experience and what type of new ways of working would ultimately fix those pain points for you. Unsurprisingly, everyone was like, we need job sharing, we need part-time roles, we need fully remote. And we were like, guys, actually, if you could just let your people go to the doctor in the middle of the day or work from home a couple times a week, you would massively change your engagement and retention. And that is what we saw longitudinally over time as we implemented these solutions in partnership with companies. In 2020, we sold the company, January 2020. And that was really interesting because at that time, it was very clear that the world could change in this direction. It was very clear that we had the technology. It was very clear that the outcomes were good, but the will was not there on behalf of the business world. And there was an inability to see, as Darren mentioned, the business advantages here. We kept assigning it as a women's problem. And that was actually a big conflict in the work that I was doing. And I think it remains a conflict today, which is that I was transparently going out and saying to executives, you need to make this change because of the impact that it's having on traditionally disenfranchised groups. And that caused business leaders to see this as solely a diversity play and not the heart of the business strategy that it really was. You will see that, if you looked at my work over the course of these past years, that around 2020, I stopped talking about this as a women's issue or having major diversity implications. Because for the first time after the pandemic, we were given the platform to talk about this as how it can transform business. Now I think it's time to bring that conversation back as we all have these return to office conversations. So when the company was sold, I was like, you know what? I'm actually not sure the world's going to get there. I can't keep trying to make fetch happen. So I am going to go to Deloitte, which is where I landed for about a year after the pandemic. Or in February 2020, my start date was February 24th, 2020. And I was like, I'll use data to help drive consulting. I'll bring an entrepreneurial attitude to consulting. I'll learn about a broader scale of business challenges. And obviously, very shortly after February 24th, 2020, Fetch did happen. And it's been very interesting to see the opportunities unfold after that. In the first year of the pandemic, I was working with the Fortune 500 to advise them on COVID response, how to take a fully, office-based, very traditional industry and company and implement, at least some aspects of distributed working, at least to get their people home. I mean, if you remember at this time, when I sold my company, I was advising CIOs to use Zoom links in their calendar invites. Like, that's where we were. In the beginning of 2020, we were running analysis to say that to get into the office with 6-foot distance would take 3 to 4 hours at the entry and exit. So these, it's just funny to remember these anecdotes and business problems. And then in a year after that, I ended up joining Facebook as the first head of remote. So Mark had come out a couple of months prior and said, we're going to really orient towards a remote, positioning. And I was the person that came in to make that happen. It was really focused on talent strategies, although we did kind of cover ground within people, products, and places. And a year after that, I got recruited by Atlassian to come join and own the business strategy that is the transformation from a formerly office-based company and to own the shift to distributed work. So at Atlassian, the way I describe my work is that we have 10 operating principles, 10 decisions that we've made that really every company has made. What's your requirement to come into the office? What are your ways of working? Do you allow people to use nomadic work? So for us, it's 90 days per year. You can work from a place that's not your home base. What kind of employee support will you give people? What kind of benefits package? So we have 10 of those operating principles. And my job is to deeply implement those operating principles into the business. So I'd say one thing that companies have done that needs improvement is that companies have made those 10 decisions, but they've not spent much time to get those decisions actually integrated into the business. So that's my job with my team and set of cross-functional partners. A big difference in the work that I was doing at Facebook versus Atlassian is that at Facebook I had a team of 5 people and 150 cross-functional partners. At Atlassian I have a team of 60 full-time employees and 40 contractors, so about 100 people, and oversee our workplace experience and real estate verticals in addition to some of the more transformational aspects. Like I have one person who works with cross-functional partners in the people team for the operating principles that touch them. I have one person who reaches into the innovation landscape, one person who really focuses on behavioral research, that kind of thing. And yeah, so I think what the difference that Darren and I have potentially is that I've always been doing the high scale enterprises. So Facebook was 70,000 people, Atlassian is 10,000 people. Atlassian is the largest distributed company in the world. And I think that many of the other kind of companies that are really committed to distributed tend to be smaller. They tend to be 2,000 and smaller. That's not to say that they're not going to grow in this next cycle into the big winners. So it's interesting to compare those two experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I ask you?
Yeah.
I was going to frame this as what are companies by and large still getting wrong about this shift? But I'm an optimist by nature, so I want to reframe that as what do you wish or what wisdom would you impart? Like the can't miss wisdom for companies that are staring at this transition. Maybe they're a bit frustrated with how it's gone.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't even know what they don't know. Why hasn't this worked?
Right.
Like why wasn't COVID work from home the same thing as remote work?
Totally.
Where do they start? What do you wish more would get right?
I love this question. And we have Christine, who runs our PR at Atlassian, in the room. And I'm always like, can you call the reporters and just tell them to ask different questions? But I think the biggest challenge, and I wonder how you'll think about this. So there are very few companies in the world that have a Darren or have a me.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
And like I said, most people have kind of said, well, we made the decisions and ta-da, But I think what is missing is that there's very little focus on design, and this is a system that needs to be designed. So when we think about factory design, right? Like that was a discipline. That was an iconic discipline where we ultimately arrived at a few management principles that were super captivating. We looked at efficiency and how to build that. And it took time to build that expertise. Similarly, with kind of 20th century management principles, really iconic players figured out kind of these core components of what it meant to lead and design work. And there's a lot of elements that require design. So I'm sure some of the things that will come up today are the risks of distributed work. And there are many, because we used to just go into an office and everybody was kind of near each other. And so things happened through osmosis. That doesn't mean they were good. So now we have to ask ourselves, what are we actually trying to do? So if we're trying to train our early career employees, well, we weren't actually training our early career employees before, but everyone was kind of like in the same mix. So, they got enough information to ultimately rise through the ranks. Yeah. But we need to now say, all right, well, here's a design principle. We want to train our early career employees. How do we improve their time to productivity? How do we optimize that? And I think that there's a lot of things that are undiscovered. For instance, one of the things that I was just thinking about and imagining as we were hearing the keynote this morning, and really these people in performance organizations, one of the really cool things that I can think about that I've experienced in a distributed world is greater access to executives. So you can actually watch. There are some teams at Atlassian who record their leadership team meetings and they make them available to everyone. How cool would it be if our principle was to help early career employees understand and get closer to an executive skill set? Maybe every month we send out 10 top leadership meetings and 10 of the best written proposals. And everybody in the company can peruse through what good really looks like. Seeing a CEO facilitate a meeting, how many years in your career did it take you until you got to see a CEO facilitate a meeting? How powerful was it as an early career attorney to see the partner, facilitate a complex negotiation and remain super calm and find the connection point with their, in theory, adversary. And that's the type of maturity that you really, as soon as you see it, you're like, ooh, I get that. I want to integrate that. And I think that's really possible in a distributed world because all the doors are open. But we're not making choices to design for that future. And so people are saying, it's super hard, I'm very uncomfortable. And they're like, so everyone come back to the office, And one question I have for you, and I want to ask you the same question, but I think one of the challenges that a lot of leaders are having right now is the difference between in-person and co-located. You know, like, talk to me about some of the pitfalls that you think business leaders are seeing and that they're potentially getting wrong or could do better in this environment.
I think for me, it starts with this realization that remote work is not a policy or a perk.
Yeah.
It is a product.
Yeah.
I would go a step further and say it is an operating model. And it is astonishing to me how many organizations have just kind of trudged through the past 3 years. And instead of leveraging that time to build fluency and muscle around this new operating model, they're just assuming, oh, we wrote a one-pager, it's a policy now, people can work from home. But we're not going to invest in changing the tools, upskilling people differently, auditing our meetings. Those are the things you would do if you acknowledged it as an operating model instead of a policy. And the mindset shift has to change if we're ever going to leverage this for what it is, which is an operating model. So by and large, a lot of the world, they're getting the most out of remote work that they can as a policy. But when you start thinking about it as, oh, this is a product, design thinking. This is a system. It's an operating system that our employees plug into. And if you look at the code of the operating system, there was a lot of bugs in the system that were patched by the office. So instead of fixing the bugs in the system, leaders would say, well, just come to the office. That'll be the patchwork. Yeah. We haven't actually codified this thing, but instead of really putting an initiative around codifying it, we'll just invite people to the office. Part of that is in-person strategy. You mentioned this when you were talking about people kind of bumped into each other in early career stages and they just found their way through the organization. That's not success. That doesn't mean the office was successful. That just means you got lucky that you didn't have to design for that. And now you get the opportunity to design for that. Yeah. It's an opportunity to do that. So what I tell people is that the best remote companies I've seen have a discrete in-person strategy. Yeah. Which on the surface seems like a juxtaposition. Like, for a remote team, why would you need an in-person strategy? Well, it's because in-person elements won't happen unless you intentionally design them into your budgets, into your culture, into people's expectations. So I think the notion of co-locating is kind of the old way. Let's take the HR team and force people to live and breathe in the same environment, whether they want to be there or not. For knowledge workers, if you've just had 3 years a taste of agency and autonomy, you're not going to relinquish that. Let's just be clear, we have experienced the greatest transfer of institutional power in any of our lifetimes. Yep. It has happened. And top talent will not give up that agency and autonomy, and they don't have to. We can build systems that allow them to. But on the in-person front, there are elements of being together in person that you cannot do as well virtually. Those are the things you need to design for. Yeah. Whether that's a new hire onboarding cohort, so anyone who joins the company in Q1, let's get them all together for some type of curated experience in Q2 so they can have that commiseration. We're all lost together. Let's bond. Humans are really good at working over video conference, not so much rapport building. Let's get together and break bread. If we get together for an offsite, don't make it 100% about work. Right. Make it at most 50% about work. Leave time for yoga sessions or hiking in the mountains or a cooking class, getting to know people. We can do the work once we all distribute back to our places of choice. What we can't do as well is build those bonds, get to know each other as we're breaking bread. And so having that in-person strategy, I think, is more critical than forcing the co-location and just hoping serendipity happens. That just seems like a less efficient way to go about it.
Yeah, and it's interesting, just tactically, some of the things that we've had to build for our in-person strategy. We looked at our spend on offices and we looked at our spend on bringing people together, and both are large sums of money and they're equal. And so, you start to wonder, do you need to rebalance those categories? And we've spent a lot of time analyzing things like our real estate. We just made some strategic reductions to our real estate using a very data-driven approach to understand and quantify business value and also look at We looked at cost per visit for every visit to the office, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. We found that every visit across the portfolio was about 4 times more expensive now than it used to be, which is not crazy because we have fewer people coming into the office. Our positioning is that you can choose your own workplace every single day. There's no mandate to come into the office. But we deeply invest in our office experience, and we're finding that 76% of the company is coming to the office every quarter. And from a user perspective, so building a product, not a perk, and having good design principles, we look at the local community surrounded by every office. And we define a local community as 2 hours commute, Monday morning, in traffic, Google Maps API. And we look at the penetration rate of those visitors into the office. So what percent of our local community is coming in? And we found that between 75% and 90% of each local office community is visiting the office every month. We also looked at risk factors related to engagement. So for every visitor, are they coming in fewer than 2 times a month? What's our percentage of our local community that's coming in fewer than 2 times per month? If there's a large percentage of our local community that's coming in fewer than 2 times per month, we're like, this isn't an engaged community. And we can either change that by driving engagement through programming, and by the way, our attendance doubles on days where we do office programming. Or we say, you know what, the cost per visit went up, the local community is not engaged, people are only coming in 2 times a month, so we're just gonna let go of this office. One thing that we have noticed globally is that regional attendance and engagement patterns are predicted regionally. The US is by far the lowest in office engagement. And I think it's because of this transfer of institutional power. People are like, this feels so good. I don't want to give it back up. Whereas in India and in Australia, really very different attendance patterns. So that has just led us to make different decisions about the sizes of our office in the US and to make sure that we're spending an appropriate amount of cost to get the appropriate business value, which we believe is connection. So offices remain important even if they're optional.
How do you think about choice? A lot of leaders are facing this battle of individualized experiences versus the team cohesion that you still want.
This is such a good question. And, Nick Bloom is one of the best researchers in the space. He's out of Stanford. And if you follow him on LinkedIn, he's always giving these bite-sized pieces of information. Highly recommend as a follow.
Thank you, Nick.
Yes. And he is always talking about cohesion and coordination. So in his dream world, hybrid means that people are co-located. So teams are near each other.
Okay.
And also that the co-located individuals cohesively come in on a cadence. Like 3 days a week, that co-located team is together. I don't think that's the answer. I think at the end of the day, that is still using the office framework to solve the problems.
Right.
And we know that good work is getting done in a virtual setting. We know that good connection work can happen in person with a good in-person strategy.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the best research in the space is Microsoft's research that was published in Nature. This was a look at 60,000 employees pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. So it was looking at early 2020 or pre-pandemic 2020 to June 2020. And they found that the biggest risk factors were flow of information and flow of culture. Yeah. So those are the things that we should be solving. And they are solvable, but continuing to rely on the office paradigm to solve them feels problematic to me. And I think a question for you is, many companies are still trying to fall back on the office paradigm because they're not thinking design. They don't have an Annie and a Darren.
Right.
And what is the cost to those companies? Looking 10 years ahead, the companies that are committing to hybrid today versus the companies like Atlassian or Andela or GitLab who are committed to building and designing the operating model of the future. Yeah. What benefit accrues and doesn't accrue in the next decade?
Yeah, this is a great question. I do want to set the stage on that kind of 3 days in, 2 days off, that modality. I think a lot of organizations who are committing to that think they're doing this is a win.
Yeah.
They're like, we're giving people more freedom and flexibility than they had this is a win. But here's the thing. If you require people to come to the office even 1 day a week, you are just as restrictive of their life as if you force them to be there every single day.
Totally.
They still have to be within a commutable space to the office. There's still limits on how far away they can go. You just can't fully redesign your life. And no one wants to just like partly redesign my life for 3 or 2 days a week. And so that's the office framework that has to be broken down. And I would take it a step further when you're thinking through this is your organization is either going to be office first by design or remote first by design. Mm-hmm. There really is no in between. Now, you may call yourselves hybrid because you have a mix of real estate and a mix of work from anywhere. But on the how work happens, it has to be such that work can happen when people are fully distributed. My business doesn't break down on days where not 100% of the people are in the office. And that way, if they do choose to come to the office, it's for a curated experience, not to go there and fundamentally do work differently that they can't do somewhere else. That's a tall task. That's why we advocate for hiring people like us to steward this change. If you haven't got the message yet, this is a huge change, and it's worth putting someone in charge of it. The chief diversity officers here remember a day when their responsibilities were a line item in the chief people officer. Like finally, we've reached a point where it's like, hey, we've grown up a little bit. So what's the cost of not doing this? I like to use the analogy of the fax machine. So if we go back in time a little bit, there was this fax machine moment for recruiting teams, which is recruiting teams had their processes perfectly dialed in on receiving CVs through the fax machine, and then it would go over here and it would go to this person. It's like perfectly dialed in. And then mankind invented ATS, Greenhouse, and email. But there were some leaders who were like, no, we're not. Like, what are the risks in going to that? Like, what if we digitize recruiting? I don't know. We're going to double down on the fax machine. Like, that just didn't age well. Yeah. And I think if you use history as a guide, there were organizations who saw the advent of social media. There were some of them that said, we're going to intentionally integrate this into our comms and marketing plan. We're going to be ahead of the curve. We don't actually know fully how this is going to go, but like, let's create the account and see where this leads us. And then there were some that said, no, we're good with the quintessential press release. We're going to send it to Business Wire. That's all we're going to do. Yeah. Those companies are less relevant now. And I think you can use history as the guide of, well, if you lag behind on something that we have created a space for this to happen, it's at your own risk. And you're already starting to see early indications of this. The most recent LinkedIn data was that for every job posted on their platform that was remote friendly, they had 4 times higher applications. Like, top talent will choose the path of most flexibility. And so unless you're totally okay with significantly narrowing the amount of people that want to work there, and potentially the partners who will be willing to work with you, because this starts sending signals about how open you are, how progressive you are for partnerships and clients. The data it's still too early to tell, but I would use history as a guide of like, you want to be on the right side of that. And I think if you were to run a scenario of the next 10 years 100 times through a model, the percentage of we're going to be more distributed as a workplace or less distributed as a workplace, I got to think that like at least 80 out of those 100 models were going to be more distributed. Like, it would have to be some pretty apocalyptic type of reversals for us to become our bubbles to get smaller and not larger.
Right, like the failure of the internet, which is not, irrelevant. And, but one thing, so I think that you're right. Like, talent is choosing this path forward, and I loved that LinkedIn data, super interesting. Mm-hmm. The sheer volume of job applications that went to the remote-friendly jobs it's really shocking. Yeah. But from a business model perspective, is there any company today that's not actually already remote first?
Yeah, I love this question. I think that from 2023, probably 2020, but from 2023 onward, every company is a remote company. Yeah. What do I mean by that? That means that unless you can guarantee that your entire workforce will not only come to one office, because by the way, if you have a Singapore office and a London office, you're already remote.
Right.
Those people, even if 100% of those two subsets go into their respective offices, they are remote to each other.
Right.
So you have to understand remote first principles and asynchronous principles. You can't just assume that everyone's going to be online at the same time. But there's actually some more interesting data, which is even if you get everyone together in the same building, if you have people on floor 7 and people on floor 2, they may as well be oceans away.
Right.
They do not engage and interact with each other. You can watch the heat map data.
Right.
Unless there's an intentional reason for them to visit, they may work together for 15 years and never see each other.
I love the IBM data, the IBM research from 1973 that established the water cooler conversation, disproved that the water cooler was an effective way of exchanging information. So it's like amazing that it continues to be quoted every single day. They basically found that if you're more than 40 feet or something from the water cooler, you basically might as well be in another country.
Yeah.
So validating, exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And I agree. I think it's like one thing that I'd love to talk to you about, because you're the master at this, is asynchronous work. So, when I look at predictions of where I think work is going, I think there's time is our greatest unit, right? It's our most scarce and important unit. And the way time will change is that AI will take away a lot of the busy work and automate a lot of that busy work. So then, in theory, we have more hours in our day. The time we spend together in environments like this one, where we're either in a virtual space or we are in a space together in person, our synchronous time will get to be a much smaller part of our day. It's a tool that many companies are using to do everything right now, but in reality, synchronous should just be used for bonding, creativity, being really, having complex information. I think that really changes the way that meetings get designed. I love people who come to me and are like, okay, yeah, like the 6 people are going to get together. We're going to solve this really big problem. And I'm like, tell me you put 30 minutes on the calendar for that. They're like, yeah, it's a 30-minute meeting. I'm like, go back to the admin and ask it to be 90 minutes or 2 hours. People need time to like relax into these topics. They need to shift. And so, what I always say with my team is like, just throw time at the problem. When something's important, you break up all your time, but people feel like they can't do that today because they're so like 30 minute. And then we have asynchronous time. So like 1, automation, 2, highly valuable time will be about half your day, the synchronous time. And then you have the rest of your day, which will be independent work. And that's where asynchronousness comes in. So I think that probably the most undervalued business skill in today's market is the ability to write concisely.
Yes.
And the best tool that I found for that recently is Smart Brevity. I'm like plugging Smart Brevity everywhere. They should pay me. But it was a book written by the founders of Axios. It just came out in January. It takes 90 minutes to read. Read it, don't listen to it. It's great. And what it does is it enables people of all levels to just deliver the most important information for their reader. So now the way that I manage that is I will, say, hey, so-and-so running this really complex project, can you send me a Smart Brevity update that I can then pass upwards and out to relevant partners and upwards to executives? And if they don't quite nail it, then I'm like, go back to the framework and try again. And this has saved me hours and hours and hours of translation time. So hugely important. When you start to work in an effective asynchronous way, it's like a drug.
Yeah.
So you get into a meeting and your teammate has spent some time putting together a document that's a 2-minute pre-read. We use Confluence, and so everything is measured in read time. And I open the 2 to 3 minute read, and I am now fully briefed on everything related to the project. It's a 30-minute meeting. I go from being uninformed and having to facilitate the understanding that I've just gained in that 3-minute pre-read. In the old days, I would have facilitated that understanding. They would have tried to tell me, I would have been like, you're talking too slow, let me ask you 10,000 questions. Now we're at minute 18, and I'm at perhaps close to a level of understanding that I otherwise would have gotten in that 3-minute pre-read. So in the async world, I got the 3-minute pre-read. I can ask all of my like insanely detailed questions. I'm so happy. Now it's minute 12 and the meeting is over. There's no further need for discussion. And what's so amazing is I can take that 3-minute or 2-minute document and I can send it to anyone, and they can have the same amount of information as I have. And when you start to operate like that as a matter of record, then all of a sudden you just have so much more accessible information, and all of that translation time that I was doing, which we call the collaboration tax, has now been a greatly reduced tax. And instead I can invest that, I can start throwing time at the problem, at work problems that I might not otherwise be able to really lean in on. One of the things that I've changed in my own way of operating is we give our CEO, he makes a lot of the decisions that we ultimately, he's kind of like the A in our DAISY. And I always instruct my team to make these micro decisions that are no longer than 3 minutes. So interestingly, and it's great, it's so effective. I think it's a huge relief for him because it's complex information and it's 3 minutes of reading that everyone can understand and a decision can be rendered. We just went through all of our documentation on what it means to be team anywhere and remote work. And we found that there were pages trying to instruct the employee population that were 15 minutes. And now we've changed them to 2 minutes using smart brevity techniques and really hyper concise writing. So again, who was spending the 15 minutes to read that stuff? So what are the 2 to 3 things that an organization needs to do to build asynchronousness into its operating model? Because it is amazing.
Yes,
It's not how I was operating at Facebook or as a lawyer or as a startup founder.
I deeply appreciate, go ahead. I deeply appreciate that tangible example of async. I want to start by giving you some data. There was a survey ran by Future Forum about a year ago, and it called out 2 data sets, and I think they represent the current frontier of remote work and then the next frontier. So the first data was 74% of people surveyed said that they appreciated and wanted flexibility in where they work. That's the current frontier of remote work. I can decouple the business results from where I am. Great. 94% said they wanted freedom and flexibility in when they work.
Yep.
Basically every human on the planet. If I had to choose between working from anywhere or working when anywhere, I would take that every time. That is only achievable in an organization if you fully embrace asynchronous workflows.
Yeah.
And so if you want to cater to basically every human on the planet, do this.
Right.
Get in the async lane, because the future of work, or the future frontier of work, is moving beyond where it happens and thinking about giving people the freedom to do it whenever they want. Okay, how do you do that? You have to build a system that doesn't optimize for knowledge transfer, as in how fast can person A get into a boardroom with person B and then share wavelengths across their brain. Instead, how can you optimize for knowledge retrieval? How can you build a system where person A and person B can tap into a system of highly trusted information, pull out what they need independent of whether or not each other are online at the same time, and then move their elements of work forward, iterate their work forward. How do you do that? You just mentioned this. You have codified rules of how we work. And taking them from 15 minutes to 3 minutes is I'm going to take that back with me, because I tend to write longer. But you're right. The shorter it is, the more likely people are to read it. And it's implementing a team or hiring a person so that you make explicit anything which is implicit. And when you start doing that, magic starts to happen, because there are fewer meetings to just get up to speed on things. The goal for your organization should be that everyone should be able to loop themselves into any project across your entire organization. There should be some written context of a proposal, of an idea, so that you don't need a meeting to have a status update. There's an amazing diagram that I would encourage people to look at. It's called the Placeless Taxonomy by the team at Workplaceless. And they designed a pyramid of things that are more attainable through async, all the way up to more attainable through sync. And it is amazing how big that chunk of work is that can be asynced if you build the systems for it to happen. And look, you have to be kind of ruthless about it. We have a no agenda, no attenda policy. So if you send me a calendar invite and there's no agenda on the invite, I'll just click no. I'm not even going to tell you why. Because if it happens enough, you'll go check the employee handbook. Why do people keep declining my meetings? Oh, no agenda, no attenda. you'll figure it out. And so it's codifying things to that level and setting the precedence that we are a memos over meetings culture. We start collaboration through the written word. And so you mentioned this, but I'll reiterate it. The dark horse skill of the next 10 years is clear and concise communication, low context communication, communicating in a way that you assume your party has low to no context, so that you have to deliver that context so they can loop themselves in. That will get you far.
And people fight that. So
Yeah.
this is,
Yeah.
I think you'll really like this. I don't know if we've talked about this before, but I want to show it to you on a screen share.
Okay.
So one of the things that we do is called Atlas. It's a new product that we have that just came out of beta like 6 months ago, maybe last September. And it was so hard to set up, but it was so worth it. And I feel like this is exactly what the, hard to set up, but so worth it is remote work and distributed work. And so what it does is we have like 3 high-level goals at the company, and then all other OKRs and goals ladder up to those goals. And so when I'm establishing my OKRs, I have a set of OKRs that ladder up to the ones that are set at the highest level, and then I have a set of projects that ultimately drives each of those goals. So in Atlas, our system, we have all of the goals, and then we have all of the projects that roll into the goals. And they are noted for the entire quarter, which is the OKR period. We set our key results on a quarterly basis. And every Monday, I get an update that is a tweet-sized update about every single project, as well as whether it's on track or off track. Because it's so easy, I can actually look at a wider remit, so I can look at partner teams' remits in addition to my own accountability chain. The hardest part of setting that up, well, one, you have to build a structure where everyone has these integrated goals and where everyone can recognize when something is a project and needs to be entered into Atlas. But getting people to write low to no context. And they're
So hard.
Annie, we assume they have some context and that they know this acronym. I'm like, no, girl, no acronyms.
No.
We're starting. We have to be comfortable with the fact that this is different and hard.
And L&D teams are the tip of the spear.
Right.
You may have never thought, let's host a course or a multi-month curriculum on low context communication. You do now. Teach your people how to do this.
Exactly. And it's the most important thing because you need to, one of the great things about this is the transparency that it creates.
Correct.
But I'm like, every update you write is actually for our CEO. And our CEO has no idea what's going on. And so, you need to make sure that the context that you're creating, and the question for you who is writing this update, do you have the context? Mm-hmm. Do we need to get into a meeting so I can explain that context to you in a better way so that you can see how this fits into the bigger picture? And I think that was one of the things that we heard today, these people in performance cultures, you can really see how you fit. And this type of transparent workflow really helps us get there.
I do want to save some time for questions.
Yeah, same.
I'll touch on the transparency bit. Your organization has to become more transparent. If you fight transparency in a remote environment, you're doomed.
Yep.
You're doomed. But the truth is, transparency becomes an enabler. It's a forcing function to what do we not know? Anything that you'll see that your team develops this spidey sense for ambiguity. If you have 2 sources of truth, or there's anything that's a little squishy, people just hone in on it. We have to solve this. We have to codify it. That's exactly what you want. In other terms, that would be called discipline.
Right.
Which your business probably wants. The last thing I'll mention here, wrapping it back to yesterday's keynote on AI, AI is going to make it so much easier to work remotely.
Totally.
In this Atlas example, there's so much intentionality that has to be done by humans to set up this structure of OKRs and the related goals. But imagine a place where you have a junior hire. They come in, they're 2 weeks on the job, and they're kind of given some goals or nudged into some goals. Imagine them being able to plug into a system and they say, how do my goals relate to the company OKRs?
Right.
This is what AI, that is incredibly empowering.
Yeah.
That would save them 6 months of being in the right room or being around the right person or watch how collaboration happens. These are the types of things that will transform how people engage and interact with this data set that people like you and I have to build. It's been difficult up until now because we basically have to teach everyone to be a master data analyzer, to understand the taxonomy that happens in my brain. How do you search through the hierarchy? AI is going to cut through all of that.
Right.
So the system designer, the chief architect, is going to be very, very important, but AI is going to help people engage with it in a massive way. And I truly think that it's going to remove a lot of the friction in working across geographies, time zones, cultures, and languages.
So to summarize, you and I see a world where work is very transparent, where things are predominantly async, that AI is a huge enabler of, efficiency and getting work done. I think we both believe that that additional time that gets accrued, especially because we've been able to choose our location, ultimately is value that accrues to our communities and families.
Yes.
And, then you start to think about, why is everyone still talking about the office? Like, you know what I mean? That is so quaint in the hierarchy of discussions. And the office remains incredibly important. We love our offices. They're the best experience, and I think they're just going to get better. But the fact that work would be organized around this paradigm that is so old relative to the things that we're talking about.
Yeah, the true conversation, and goes back to the questions I wish reporters would ask, what we're actually building here is the future of living.
Right, exactly.
And it's going to be enabled by the future of work. If you look ahead 50 years or 100 years, when historians write about this era, what they will write about are data around reversal of rural depopulation, around more people having in-home elder care, on the orphan crisis being reduced because people have more time and space to foster and adopt compared to the rigidity of what they used to live with. And then under that, they'll say, oh, well, it was enabled because remote work became a product.
Right.
Like this will be the footnote.
Right.
But right now, it's like all we can think about.
Right.
But the truth is, it will just be the footnote of much more systemic societal change. And that's what I'm excited about. I mean, I'll say this at every opportunity I get. I'm an adoptive father. And my journey to adoption was made so much easier because I had an employer that allowed freedom and flexibility. You mentioned going to a doctor's appointment in the middle of the day. We were able to go do all of these things that you need to do in the middle of the day.
Right.
That is incredibly empowering. There is one fewer orphan in the world. He lives with me because I was able to be in a space where that was possible. That's why I do what I do.
Right.
The work part of it is fun, don't get me wrong. But this is way bigger than work. And the more that we can wrap our heads around that, it gives us the why. Why do I want to change my ways of working? Why do I want to learn how to write? Why do I want to lean into async?
Right.
It's for reasons like that.
And I think those are things that people are understanding at a higher scale. I think one way that we're different, and we were joking about this at dinner a couple weeks ago, is like, I'm a total corporate wonk. I love to work. Working 100-hour weeks, like that felt good to me at a time, right? And now I have such a different understanding of what it means to live. I'm a single mother with two parents. I do have two parents. I'm a single mother with two children. One has, significant special needs. Being able to work in this way has absolutely transformed my day-to-day experience in my life and has given me far richer centers of value than just the work that I was doing. And that makes me a better parent. It makes me a better community member. It makes me a better person. And I hope that, there are many others, reformed lawyers, discovering this for themselves. We'd love to turn it to you for questions.
Let's do it.
Or we'll keep talking at each other. Clearly, we haven't spent enough time to each other lately. Where should we start? Your hand was up first.
Do we want to? You want to pass the mic around, Charlie?
Yeah.
Let's do the mic. Yeah, sure.
We're both the same place, so the same question. Since last night and way before, one of the things that I am curious about in this whole new wave is, when the pandemic hit, we went to remote work in technology really quickly and really successfully and almost seamlessly, and found many different areas of tremendous productivity improvements that were unexpected. And I could go function by function and tell you where these things all occurred. But one that has worried me a bunch is, how do people get promoted? How do you actually climb the ladder or grow in stature? How do you find your next GM or your next CEO in this model? And I think, you two have lived it longer than any of the rest of us, and maybe you've seen how this works. Follow-on question that you can take, Darren, later, because I think this is mostly for you, is that, you're hypothesizing, or at least describing to me, that this is all or nothing. You either have to buy into this entirely and flip your entire view of the world to what you're preaching, or you're going to fail. If you have to come to the office one day, it doesn't work. So I want to try to understand whether, is that what you're really saying?
Yeah,
and then
sure.
As a practical matter, given the nature of the world,
Sure.
How many companies and CEOs and boards are even remotely ready
Right.
to accept that?
Right. I'll answer that one first while the mic
Yeah.
transfers back up. I think that, thanks for pointing that out. I think organizations will choose. I don't see it as a zero-sum game. I think pre-COVID, you really had very few options of how you worked and where you worked. You were fully in office, and maybe you could find a hybrid organization, and then there were anomalies like GitLab that you could latch onto. Post-COVID, the fully in-office organizations will still be there. The hybrid organizations will be there, but now we have an entirely new sector that people can plug into. So I think it's a net addition. I will say, though, for the organizations that double down on being fully in person, fully in office, they'll get what they get. The difference is they were operating in that construct in a world where people didn't have other options. When you give people more options, now that operating model is competing with another operating model. And so I don't think we're going to see a world where that completely fails or doesn't work for some organizations. But they need to be honest with themselves about who's going to self-select into that and who's going to self-repel out of that, and recognize that the competitive landscape has changed. They are now intentionally competing with a different operating model that I do think will get better faster than the older model.
And my 30-second view on that is that offices and remote operating, when we said, isn't every company a remote company? I don't think that those things are actually coupled. They appear to be coupled, but they don't need to be. And so I do think that every company needs to decouple the office from their operations, but that doesn't mean that they need to discourage office attendance. I think people are actually, the office will continue to be a very important center of activity.
Yeah.
Your work product.
Exactly.
Yes.
Remote or hybrid concept.
And
Correct.
the companies that force the office issue, they're going to be less exposed to risk for a period of time. And so it's going to look attractive. But then there will be a time where the technology is so obvious and the operating model is so real, and we'll have at that point the next, who's the best theorist of leadership in the 20th century? That theorist will exist, and it'll be very clear what it means to set up the organization of the future. And only at that time will, the kind of CEOs begin to let go.
Yeah, Darren's had the luxury in your company is it started day one.
Yeah.
Completely remote.
Right.
And you didn't have to change from A to B.
Right.
But everybody else has got to go from A to B.
Right.
Yeah.
And promotions. So I can say that I've looked at promotion data in a couple of different places. Promotions are not yet a big screaming flag. That's not to say that they won't be in the future. But I think what the next CEO looks like is somebody who is extremely able to experiment with new technologies. So for instance, I know that everyone's like, don't let my son use ChatGPT to cheat on their homework. I'm like, everyone cheat on your homework. I think CHROs don't want people to write their performance reviews using ChatGPT. I'm thinking about asking my entire org to write their first draft using ChatGPT. We want people to be very experimental with technology. I think the people of the future, the leaders of the future, are going to be really good at work. because they have spent a lot of time in this async focus time, really honing their craft. They're great writers, they're great problem solvers, they're really comfortable with change, and they have great digital presence. So they can lead through a screen, they can bring their personality to establish themselves in any of the smaller windows of and settings that they might have with senior leaders. But I don't think that those people aren't going to shine through. So let's see. But again, the companies that have the 3-day in-person, they're probably going to have higher rates of promotion in that group. And again, it's like they face lower risk to the operating model in the coming years, but there will be more significant changes in the future. Tyson, I know you had a question. Do you want to just shout it from the rooftops?
Yeah, so, I there's a lot that sounds good.
Yeah.
Remote work, and there's a lot of advantages, and a lot more flexibility and all this sort of stuff. Andy's looking at me because he's like, I've been doing this for years. And I want to focus in a little bit on the people that can be left behind and some of the negatives, loneliness, right? Burnout, disengagement. I've heard that there are people that have, sometimes they do 2 remote jobs.
Yeah, we see that.
They use that flexibility
Yes.
to
CEOs of the future.
and that gets into productivity and promotions and everything else. But it's like, what are the gotchas here? And what are the ways that you can, through processes or through, check-ins or something like that, to mitigate those? There are going to be personalities that were very successful in office. There will be personalities that are very successful in a remote environment. There will also be people that are left behind.
I think that the biggest risk factors are connection and effectiveness. And you're like, wait, isn't that a whole company? Isn't that the whole point? But we have to be very intentional about making sure that people stay connected and very intentional about how people stay effective. And it means that we need to study our approach to connection and study our approach to effectiveness to understand what's not working and keep tweaking it, which is why this operating model is a product, not a talent strategy. Mm-hmm. I do think that some of the risk factors that are commonly shared about this model, like loneliness, and I'm not to say that those things aren't real, or that there aren't winners and losers in this model. I do think that it's appropriate for these high levels of engagement and connectedness in our work communities to resettle to a lower but still healthy new baseline and have that additional kind of connection juice reinvested in our families and local communities.
Yes.
And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I do think that there are many more winners in this model than there were in the previous model, just because people who are disabled, women, parents, those are the winners. And what do you think?
Introverts too.
Introverts, yeah.
Yeah, look, everything has a trade-off, everything. But it's the things you mentioned to begin with, I don't think those are exclusive to remote work.
Yeah.
I've been in an office and I've been lonely and not engaged and not connected. And I've also been in a remote setting in the wrong team or the wrong structure where all of those things have been present as well. But the thing that I'll mention here is I do think in the future, culture will largely be built from outside of the workplace. This is going to break the frame of a lot of people leaders, where they've seen it as their almost idol in the organization. Like, we are where everyone's social reservoir gets filled. In the future, it's not. You build a great place to work, and belonging and connection comes from that. You make it easy for people to work together. It's frictionless to work together and jam together. That you feel connected, you feel belonging. But instead of forcing people into a video conference for an hour on the end of a Friday, you take that same hour, you deploy them in their local communities, and you tell them to do something that's fulfilling to them. Wear company swag, take a selfie, share it back. Now you have genuine connection. And so people are going to be more responsible for their own social reservoir filling. People are going to have to, this ups the game, just like AI ups the bar. People are going to have to plug into organizations and to some degree be more self-responsible for filling their own social reservoir. I think this is a net long-term benefit to family and community. But you may have to be a bit explicit at telling them that, hey, this is actually not fully on the org anymore. Yeah. We're allowing you to work from anywhere, but the trade-off is you got to make sure that you're keeping yourself healthy.
Yeah. I know we're at time. But if there are follow-up questions, we'd be happy to answer them async.
We're both on the internet, so
Yes.
yes.
Thank you so much for the conversation and for having us.
Thanks all.
Thank you.